welcome journalists Allison Herrera of Osage News and Nick Bowlin of the Frontier to discuss wastewater pollution and oil and gas production outside of the Osage Minerals estate, including how the Frontier reported on the issue and what lessons can be applied here in the community. Allison, please take it away.
Hi, thanks everyone. And I just wanted to thank all the presenters previously for all the inspiring words and for all of your information and knowledge. And I wanted to thank Osage News and particularly Shannon Shaw-Judy, the editor, and the staff who's just been so great to work with. So I'm here with Nick Bowlin. Nick covers oil and gas as part of ProPublica's local reporting network, and ProPublica is a national investigative news site that's covered anything from reproductive rights to oil and gas to illegal marijuana grows here in Oklahoma and beyond. Before that, before being the part of ProPublica's local reporting network, he was a contributing editor for High Country News, where he wrote about also the oil and gas industry, affordable housing, and public lands. His freelance work has appeared in The Nation, Harper's, and Outside Magazine, among other places, and he grew up in Tulsa. So thanks for being here, Nick. And I'm Allison Herrera, and I am a freelancer for Osage News, and I cover the Osage Minerals Council. So thanks so much. So Nick, you recently published a story for The Frontier, an investigative news outlet based in Tulsa, about saltwater purges and oil wastewater pollution here in Oklahoma, and how the Oklahoma Corporation Commission failed to regulate the industry. Your story detailed how saltwater laced with cancer-causing chemicals, which is a byproduct of oil and gas drilling, is spewing from old oil wells. Experts warn of a pollution crisis spreading underground and threatening Oklahoma's water. And we're talking about this story for this panel because on the Osage Nation reservation, there are more than between 1,600 and 2,300 abandoned oil wells. And that's most likely an undercount. A lot of people say that there are thousands more than that. And so when I saw this story, it caught my eye because, one, I report on abandoned oil wells, and I've seen how saltwater leaks have damaged the land here, so I wanted to know more about this story. So, Nick, my first question for you is, how did you find this story?
Well, thank you, Allison, and I also wanted to thank the Osage News for having me here, and Shannon and Allison for inviting me up, and to all the other presenters. It's been a wonderful day. So I heard about this issue, the saltwater purge issue, after publishing a couple stories last year about oil and gas pollution in Oklahoma, and was contacted by concerned citizens, state officials, a really kind of startlingly large number of folks who were saying, like these saltwater pollution events are not, it's not just one or two. This is a statewide issue, and I think this is probably the most significant part about the story. This is a state where we've been, drilling for oil and gas for 120 years. There's a fantastically large amount of legacy oil pollution, old spills, everything. You guys, I don't need to tell you about the legacy of this industry, but that this was not old pollution. These were, highly pressurized events. These are geysers coming out of the ground or out of old wells, and it was very clear that there was this epidemic of pollution from current injection, and that had not been reported before.
Yeah, I was just reading in your story that the state has cataloged about 20,000 orphan wells, but federal researchers say that there's more likely like 300,000 based on the historic data, because like you said, the state's been drilling for oil for over 120 years. My next question for you is, what is a purge and what causes it? And actually, I think we're going to play the video in the story to show you what a purge is. scroll down just a little bit more. I know, I like that. Oh, this one, okay, here we go. The video kind of loops back, but you'll be able to see. So, actually, can you hit blank answer? There it is. That's the water byproduct coming out of the ground. And when you drill for oil, the salt water is like we explained is a byproduct of the drilling. So can you explain what a purge is like? What are we seeing there?
Yeah, so this is an orphan well, and the water that is coming out of it is, so it is injected underground somewhere nearby. And when an injection well, so whether it's a saltwater disposal well or an injection well that is used as part of the oil and gas production process, this is usually called water flooding. Either type of well, when the well is permitted, the permit specifies, that the pressure from the injection is supposed to dissipate within a relatively small distance, usually about a half mile. It's not supposed to do this. It's not supposed to, breach the rock layer underground. It's not supposed to travel for miles at a time, and it's definitely not supposed to run up, the casing of nearby orphan wells. But this is happening all the time in Oklahoma. There have been, at times the state has been receiving dozens of, reports per month of purging well bores, usually orphan wells all over the state. And so what this means is that you have this injected wastewater fluid, 10 times saltier than the sea, laden with heavy metals, chemicals, most of them naturally, this is all naturally occurring, but it's still very nasty stuff. And the oil and gas companies inject it back underground, and it's not staying there. And so what the story essentially is based on is a large collection of public records that I got from the OCC, where it shows that the OCC has been aware for years that it has a pressure problem, that injection wells, disposal wells that are operating, often legally, are operating at pressures that are too high for the geologic interval where the injection is taking place. This water is cracking the rock, spreading underground, and these are huge volumes and high pressures, and they've documented the wastewater surfacing out of abandoned wells, like you saw in the video. And if you scroll down the page a little bit, there's another kind of nasty video that's fun to look at. Traveling miles underground before it encounters a natural fault, an orphan well, any sort of vertical conduit to the surface. And because it's so highly pressured, it does this. It doesn't seep to the surface, it gushes to the surface. This is out of an orphan well near Velma. And this is not just an Oklahoma problem. Researchers in West Texas at one point documented injected wastewater traveling 12 miles underground before exploding out of an orphan well. So, once this injected wastewater breaks containment, can end up anywhere. It's really hard to track. Usually we find out about it when it does something like this, when it ends up in your drinking water, whether it explodes to the surface.
Yeah, and I wanted to go back to the pipe and the casing. Like, so when somebody drills for oil under, the casing is supposed to contain, it's supposed to not crack, and that also is how the water is getting in there and pluming at the top like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is, the injected wastewater problem. It's not just pressure. You kind of need a toxic mix of factors to create, the purge crisis that my story documented. And one of them is, as you say, the, enormous number of old orphan wells. Sometimes they have the casing pulled. Sometimes it's just degraded. Someone said earlier, the well drilled in 1917, what's the state of, it's just pockmarked with holes. And so, you know, in a different state that didn't have so many orphan wells, you know, the pressure problem would still be bad. You know, you don't want this wastewater running around underground. But what makes this a real crisis in Oklahoma is that these oil and gas formations are just riddled with these open well bores, with degraded casing, with mud plugs, without the proper cement plugs or insufficient cement plugs, and that offers this injected wastewater just a super highway from deep below ground up into our lives.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, the oil and gas producers, they're supposed to put up a bond when they start to drill here in Osage County, and that bond can be between $50,000 and $75,000. And so, in theory, that money is supposed to be used to clean up stuff like this, or to clean up, to be able to plug the abandoned well, and not with just mud, but cement. And sometimes I've seen wells that have been plugged with just with some sticks, with some tree branches or whatever. And so that is another way in which these wells are spewing this really toxic water. You mentioned industry people that you talk with. You got people to talk to you from the OCC, and how did you do that? And what did they say? Because I would imagine some people would be really hesitant that work for the Oklahoma Corporation Commission to say, yeah, that's right, we've got a wastewater injection problem.
So this is an internal conundrum for journalists is trying to get people on the record. I was very lucky for this story to have a former petroleum engineer for the OCC, guy with decades of experience in the oil field, who had been hired by the OCC to help address the purges, and left disenchanted. I think is probably he was furious. He was incensed at the OCC's inability to kind of rein in this injection problem. He was willing to go on the record to talk about his time at the OCC, and then I conducted extensive interviews with current officials at the oil division, and they defended their response to these purges, but in a certain sense, it's you've seen these videos, and they're incidents like this that were flowing for months at a time or over a year. They just couldn't get the pressure under control, and so it's hard to deny that. And so they were pretty candid with me. They said, we do have a pressure problem. We have wells that are operating in violation of their permit. We haven't known about it until we investigate them. And we also have wells that are operating legally within their legal pressure limits, and the legal pressure limits are the problem. They're too high, and the wastewater is spreading underground with a well operating within its legal purview. And they have there have been adjustments to the state injection rules. Obviously, this does not apply on the Osage Nation, that have reduced somewhat injection pressures for newly permitted wells, but to reduce pressure statewide. And Oklahoma has a huge number of injection wells, over 10,600 currently active disposal and EOR wells. It would take an act of the state legislature to actually reduce pressure statewide. So this is still a live problem.
Yeah, that was my other question to you. What are regulators supposed to be doing to prevent this from happening? And then when they do find out, do they contact the operator? Do they, demand that they shut the well off until the problem can be fixed, until the pressure problem is fixed? What are they supposed to be doing to make sure that we don't see stuff like this?
That's a very good question. So, if you get a purge, the kind of standard operating procedure these days, and this has been developed over a number of years, but the state will usually shut down all injectors within a certain radius. If they can't get the flow to stop, they'll push that radius out. If the water is actually purging to the surface, they'll usually get pump trucks in there and try to pump off the produced water, do some surface restoration and remediation. But this is something, again, the OCC was pretty upfront about this, is once this stuff has polluted aquifers and groundwater sources, you can't unmix that pollution. The volumes here are tremendous. And, there are drinking water sources that, I talk about in the story where, this is essentially now, the pollution will flush out on a time, beyond beyond the length of a human, lifespan. So, that once this pollution's out, once it's in drinking water sources, there's nothing really you can do about it. Now, getting a hold on, being proactive about the purge thing would be, this is probably unrealistic for Oklahoma, but reducing injection pressures across the board would be a good start. And the other thing is, and Allison, you gestured at this, it's not just that the pressure's high, but it's making sure that idled and unplugged and orphan wells get plugged properly. And so, other states that have dealt with this have increased their bonding requirements substantially. They've funded orphan well plugging programs in a way that Oklahoma really doesn't. It's essentially getting the industry to pay up, whether in the form of a plugging fund or really jacking up the surety bond requirements. That would be, that would be a serious effort to prevent purges.
You also talk to ranchers, and you also talk to regular people who've had their groundwater contaminated by this. What did they say to you?
The story quotes a couple who live near cement, who, they wound up with benzene in their drinking water at several times the EPA drinking water limit. They've installed a bunch of filtration systems in their house, but, this is, no one wants to buy their house now. They're kind of stuck with this, and they're just kind of hoping that these pollutants don't leukemia is the kind of obvious cancer associated with benzene. They're just crossing their fingers and hoping this doesn't hurt them. There's been a pretty significant purge ongoing near Eakley that's killed a couple dozen cattle in September, and we've got some pictures that the rancher provided that are pretty sad. But once this water, as I'm repeating myself, but once this water is polluted, this is that's not something you can reverse. And so and the state is pursuing the company doing the disposal in administrative law court, but I don't know if the rancher's getting compensated for this, and even if he were for the cattle, this creek and the groundwater feeding it, they're polluted indefinitely.
That was going to be my next question, is that can individual cattle ranches or individual families like the one that you profiled, can they sue, can they take legal action against these companies that are overpressurizing these wells and permitting these purges?
So the short answer is yes, and on subsequent stories I'm doing in this project, now that I've kind of got a story about the OCC out of the way, I'm going to be focusing more directly on harm to the environment and people. So I'll be covering individuals who've been injured by this stuff, and who are in some cases suing oil companies, are suing disposal companies, suing their insurance companies if they have a claim denied. There are real obstacles to this. There are specifics to Oklahoma state law that make pursuing private nuisance cases, which is usually what you would sue for this, makes it pretty hard. Damages are capped, so even if a landowner does sue, they're probably not going to get the fully restored for the amount of damage. And I've talked to this isn't theoretical. I've talked to landowners who say, let's say I lose the case, and the subsurface, and surface rights have been split, and I have to let the oil companies pumpers on my land. I have to keep my gates open. I have to let them into my pastures. Is it worth the hassle to sue them in court, lose, and then have to deal with the operator, indefinitely? In some cases they say that's not worth it, and nothing happens.
You were talking earlier about wastewater injection, and you cited the number for the state of Oklahoma, but what's the number for Osage County? And can you talk a little bit more about wastewater and what wastewater injection is?
Yeah, so Oklahoma has a little over 10,000 injection and disposal wells total right now. That does not include Osage County. In Osage County, EOR plus disposal wells is about...
EOR that stands for Enhanced Oil Recovery, and that's tertiary recovery. So that's where they don't drill, they drill horizontally. That's basically fracking.
Yeah, so EOR wells, I'm sure many of you know this, but you get a depleted reservoir. You need to keep reservoir pressure high in order to continue producing. So you take the wastewater, you re-inject it into the reservoir, and in some ways almost push the oil towards a producing well. Yeah. And so in Osage County, there's about 2,300 of these wells, which I gotta think if you extrapolated that statewide, that's a much higher concentration than the rest of the state. And Allison, you reported on this. There's a tremendous amount of oil field brine pollution here, from actual saltwater purges, from flow line leaks, from tank batteries, the whole leaking orphan wells, the whole 9 yards. And so, and the same dynamics that apply to Oklahoma apply here, that the amount of produced water that the industry is dealing with is going up by the year, and the reservoirs that are taking this stuff are filling up. I mean, I was on a webinar recently where the Texas oil and gas industry was talking about the main basin that they use to dispose of oil field wastewater in West Texas. They're worried it's going to be full in a year, the Delaware Basin. And I mean, this is serving what is now one of the largest oil fields in the world, and Texas oil and gas companies don't know where it's all going to go. And there are similar, that dynamic is coming here. And the oil and gas formations in the Osage Nation, a lot of them are very tightly stacked, coal bed methane on top of oil, on top of gas. And that new production that would try to get that out, if you're using hydraulic fracturing, your unconventional wells that are going into those formations laterally, that produces a ton of water. You're hitting these mixed pockets that are way more watery than just conventional drilling. And so this is that ratio. It's just getting worse by the year, and I don't know how much injection takes place in Osage County, but I know for Oklahoma as a whole, it's about 70 billion gallons a year, and this problem is going to get worse. The reservoirs are going to fill up. The orphan well problem isn't going anywhere. You're just trying to cram a tremendous amount of water underground.
One thing, I'm holding up this glass because I'm going to talk about pore space. So recently, in Osage County, the AG, the Attorney General's office, issued this opinion about pore space, which is like if you look at this glass, like the ice and the iced tea here, it's like this space in between. So think about like underground, there are these pockets of air, pockets in between the rock and the earth, and so that's pore space. And the AG's office recently issued this opinion that said that the surface owner, that state law, not Osage tribal law, governs who owns pore space, and it's a pretty big issue. I wanted to know how does that affect the issue that we're talking about here, like pore space?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think pore space is increasingly at a premium. Just, simple volumes filling this stuff up. There are significant carbon sequestration projects, on the Osage Nation where, again, they need pore space to inject that CO2. I'm the first to admit that, I think everyone in this room knows more about Osage tribal governance than I do, but this opinion from Drummond, as I understand it, severs, it attempts to sever, who owns the pore space from the minerals estate and attach it to the landowner. I don't have any, educated predictions on where that's going, but I do think that the conflict over pore space is going to intensify.
Yeah, I think I recently just wrote an article about that, and yeah, Shannon, you have a question?
So how is pore space handled outside of Osage County?
Pore space is, it's considered part of the mineral. If we were looking at the rest of Oklahoma being a mineral estate, it's considered, I think it's considered part of the minerals estate. I think it's not. It's considered separate from the minerals estate, excuse me, yeah.
So would it be correct in saying that outside of Osage County, the surface owner owns the pore space and they lease it? Is that how that normally works?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And this is, beyond the kind of ownership of subsurface stuff, yeah, I think just as the industry's produced water problem gets worse, I saw a recent court case in Texas where a rancher was trying to claim that the produced water that came up under his land belonged to him, not the oil and gas company. He was saying, you guys have the rights to the minerals, but you don't have the rights to the water. And so I think, pore space, water, all this stuff, we are in, there's some kind of uncharted territory here with the legal conflicts that are coming.
So would it be safe to say, yes, Nona.
I have a question in the lower 76 where it's Corporation Commission. How do they look at it if there's a surface owner and then they've severed the minerals and there's a mineral owner? Who has the pore space then?
That is a great question, and I've seen different in some ways I think it often depends on, the specifics of the mineral ownership, but I've seen cases where, the surface owner does own the pore space and so can sell, even if there's a producer, drilling for oil and gas can sell, some of the pore space to a disposal company. But then in other cases that pore space is gone, right? That pore space is connected to the mineral estate, and it's up to the oil and gas company to, dispose into those intervals.
But the state of Oklahoma has ruled that in the lower 76 that the surface owner owns the pore space, but the surface owner is a rancher, and then the minerals have been severed, and underneath that the oil and gas operator is trying to produce it. So you're telling me that if the surface owner owns the pore space, he can keep them from using the pore space for the oil and gas production, even though the minerals is the dominant estate in Oklahoma, correct?
That's a really good question. I would think that the surface owner would be able to deny the producer the use of the pore space if he doesn't want, if that rancher doesn't want, that used for disposing wastewater.
But no, you are right that the mineral claim is the dominant one, and I will freely admit that I haven't seen an injection well application where that conflict's been adjudicated in administrative law court. I would love to see one because that'd be fascinating. So if you see one, let me know. But I I will say that this is one of our subsequent stories that we're trying to do is the, that essentially injection and disposal wells permits are never denied by the state. It's just totally rubber stamped. And I gotta think that process will get more contested with time as, drinking water supplies. I'm following a case in Enid where Enid is trying to fight off new disposal wells next to its public water supply. I think that those application processes will stop being so quick.
This graphic here, I wanted to ask, we've been talking about, the problem, but what is actually the solution to the problem, other than just regulation? Is it just, is it making sure that the well is plugged properly? And we have this, this is part of your story here. We have, a well that's been plugged, and we have one that's been unplugged or abandoned, and then another one that has the casing is failing.
Yeah, so this graphic we whipped up, and it's a little simplified just for ease, but you can see an injection well where it's shooting out produced water, and a plugged well is safe, and then an orphan well creates a purge. I think that reducing injection pressures is politically difficult in Oklahoma right now. Industry has fought various attempts to reduce pressures very hard. I do think dealing with all of these vertical conduits is we probably have 300,000 more orphan wells than the state knows about, so that's an equally large challenge. But if you could snap your fingers and do one thing right now, plugging every orphan well in the state would go a long way towards making sure the wastewater doesn't escape up towards the surface and drinking water.
I think thank you so much for writing the story and your expertise and time on this. And so I just wanted to open it up for questions. I think I saw a couple people back there. Yeah, right here. She's got the microphone.
So I'm a novice listening to all of this. I only heard of pore space as of yesterday reading an article. But I'm curious, how is volume of pore space quantified in order for a landowner to even sell it? Like, what does that look like? How do you know how much pore space you have?
I think you would have to get you'd have to do a geological survey. So you'd have to have somebody come out and survey your land to tell you, well, you have X amount of cubic feet of pore space in order to know that you could be able to sell it. But that's a really good question. I think that's another really good story. I think, yeah. Oh. I think we answered it. We answered all your questions. I don't know. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you. Thanks.